In this lecture, we will introduce the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and my name is Dr. Joe Sprinkle. The book of Chronicles overlaps with the books of Samuel and Kings. 1st Chronicle 10 covers the same ground as 1 Samuel chapter 31, the story of Saul's death at Gilboa. Chronicles ends with Cyrus's decree allowing the Jews to return to Judah and rebuild the temple. And it looks like Chronicles was written to encourage Jews after the Babylonian exile who were reestablishing the state of Judah and temple worship. The English title, Chronicles, is derived from the Hebrew title, Divrei Hayamim, the affairs of the day, that is, the annals are chronicles. The Greek translation, the Septuagint, LXX, entitles it Paraliponia, things left out. And this title reflects the fact that this work supplements Samuel and Kings with some new material. Authorship of Chronicles is unknown. Scholars label him the chronicler. The chronicler may have also written Ezra Nehemiah. That's what the typical critical scholar position is. At the very least, Ezra begins by quoting the end of 2nd Chronicles, the decree of Cyrus allowing the Jews to return from Babylonian exile. The date of Chronicles is clearly a post-exilic work because it does refer to Cyrus, king of Persia, allowing the exiles to return. The book also uses Persian units of money at various points. It talks about the darics in 1 Chronicles 29:7, and this implies that the chronicler wrote during the Persian period. The date of Chronicles is after Samuel and King, relatively speaking. Chronicles seems clearly to use the books of Samuel and Kings as one of its sources. Samuel and Kings probably dates to the exile, as we've discussed in earlier lectures, while Chronicles dates to after the exile. There are sources used by the chronicler. As we mentioned, Samuel and Kings. About 50% of Chronicles material seems to be derived from the books of Samuel and Kings. Other sources are also mentioned. The records of Samuel the seer, of Nathan the prophet, and Gad the seer, 1 Chronicles 29:29. Shemaiah the prophet, Iddo the seer are mentioned in 2 Chronicles 12:5. And the works of the prophet Iddo is mentioned in 13:22. The chronicler seems to have used all of those things as sources. The audience of Chronicles is the post-exilic community in Jerusalem, which explains why the chronicler's interest is in Judah, the part of Israel that survived, not so much the northern kingdom of Israel, which he virtually ignores. He also stresses temple worship, which was established by David and Solomon, trying to emphasize the continuity of worship at the temple before and after the Babylonian exile. As far as historicity, critical scholars, that is liberal scholars, doubt the historical reliability of Chronicles. That's in part because it was written further from the events from the author of Samuel and Kings. But a later date of authorship doesn't necessarily mean inaccurate history writing. A good historian can write an accurate history without being contemporary with the events he writes about. And we, for our part at least, will accept Chronicles as historically reliable. What's the purpose of 1st and 2nd Chronicles? Well, as the Septuagint suggests, it supplements Samuel and Kings with some additional material. It gives further theological interpretation of events in Samuel and Kings. Sometimes Samuel and Kings will just say that someone did something, but then it'll explain why they did it or what the Lord thought about what they did and give a theological interpretation of events that are simply recorded as having happened in Samuel and Kings. And it also answers theological questions facing this post-exilic audience that he was addressing. They might have been asking the question, are we still the people of God, even though we've been in exile? Do we still have a covenant with God? How do God's promises to Israel and Jerusalem to David still relate to us, if at all? The theology of Chronicles, and I'm going to divide that into two sections. First, the theology of the genealogies, which is 1 Chronicles chapters 1 through 9. The fact that it begins with 9 chapters of genealogies makes this book daunting if one is simply reading through the Bible. But it starts with the election of Israel. It gives a genealogy all the way from Adam to Israel, showing God's choice of Israel. But then the next major unit emphasizes the election of David as king. The tribe of Judah and the house of David are highly stressed in these genealogies in chapters 2 through 4. Also, the priesthood and worship are emphasized. The tribe of Levi receives a whole chapter in the genealogy of chapter 6. Now, it does mention Saul's tribe Benjamin in chapter 7 and into chapter 8. But the emphasis is on the renewal and continuity with Israel's past. The returning exiles are brought up in chapter 9, verses 2 through 44. And thus it's linking the post-exilic community with the election of Israel and David. And so very subtly, this genealogy is trying to say that God is still working with his people in continuity with the promises which he's made in the past. Only the tribes that remain faithful to Davidic kingship, that is, Judah, Levi, and Benjamin, are stressed in the genealogy of 1 Chronicles 1 through 9. In contrast, the other tribes receive only very short treatment, and 2 of the tribes, Zebulun and Dan, are for some reason omitted altogether. Well, what about the theology of Chronicles narratives? One of the themes in the narratives is the unity of God's people. The chronicler emphasizes the expression, all Israel. Although in a sense you might not call them Israel, because at least most of the 10 northern tribes were exiled and assimilated into the Assyrians. But by calling what's left, the remnant, all Israel, they were emphasizing that this is still God's people. All Israel had embraced David. Elements of all Israel had fled to Judah. Mentions, for example, in 2 Chronicles 34 that the people of Manasseh, Ephraim, and the entire remnant of Israel had gone from the north to the south to avoid exile and assimilation. So at least remnants of all 10 tribes were there. Judah now thus constitutes all Israel. And this expression, all Israel, expresses the idea of unity. And the ideal of unity should be expressed in God's people, the church, all united around David, our King, the Son of David, Jesus Christ. A second theological theme in the narratives of Chronicles is the choice of David. David dominates 1 Chronicles, emphasizing that he's a man after God's own heart, emphasizing his role in establishing right worship, and how David's son Solomon and the fortunes of Judah were the heirs of the Davidic covenant. It idealizes David to the point of stressing the positive and ignoring some of the negatives. For example, the sins of David in committing adultery with Bathsheba and murdering her husband Uriah are simply not brought up. And it stresses the Davidic kingdom of Judah rather than the northern kingdom of Israel that had rejected David and thereby had rejected Yahweh. There are messianic implications of the choice of David. The chronicler had a messianic doctrine that saw a future role for the Davidic monarchy after the exile. And if we read Chronicles from the New Testament perspective, the emphasis on Davidic rule is clearly understood in the light of Jesus Christ, who is a descendant of David. The final theme in the book is the centrality of worship. The Ark of the Covenant and Jerusalem and the temple and the sacrificial system and priests and Levitical musicians and the Davidic king who sits on Yahweh's throne all focus on proper worship of Yahweh. Chronicles gives much more detail on the preparations that David made for building the temple than does Samuel and Kings. And so it has a focus on worship. And we might ask ourselves, is worship central to us as it was to the chronicler? That's my introduction to the book of Chronicles, and my name is Dr. Joe Sprinkle.